Dominique Ashford had her hands inside a delivery van's engine bay. Diagnosing a fuel system problem two other shops had already failed to identify correctly. When Preston Yates walked into her garage and asked to speak to whoever's actually in charge here. "That would be me," Dominique said, not looking up from the engine. "I own this shop." Preston laughed, short and dismissive. The particular laugh of a man who decided something about a room before he'd bothered to look at it closely. "I need my fleet serviced by someone with real ACE certification, not whoever's answering phones today. I've been ACE Master certified for 9 years, Dominique said, straightening up, wiping her hands on a rag, "and I already found your fuel pressure regulator issue. 2 shops before me missed it." "I'd like a second opinion," Preston said, glancing around the garage like he'd wandered somewhere he hadn't meant to end up. "From someone with actual experience." Jasper Cole, sitting in the waiting area with his own bike up on Dominique's lift, set down the magazine he'd been reading and didn't say a word, not yet. What happened over the following week would end with 130 motorcycles filling the street outside Ashford Auto and Cycle in Bellwood, South Carolina, and a fleet manager learning exactly how much respect an entire community had built around the mechanic he'd decided, on sight, wasn't worth taking seriously. Bellwood sat in the South Carolina Midlands, a town of textile history and quiet growth, and Dominique Ashford had built Ashford Auto and Cycle from a single rented bay 8 years earlier into the most trusted repair shop in 3 counties for anyone who rode or drove something worth keeping running properly. Jasper Cole was 47 years old, a member of the Iron Vow Motorcycle Club, and had been bringing his bike to Dominique exclusively for 6 years, ever since she diagnosed an intermittent electrical problem that 2 other shops had charged him for and failed to fix. He wasn't the only rider in the chapter who felt that way. Half the club brought their bikes to Ashford Auto now, word having spread the way it does among people who've learned exactly whose diagnosis to trust. Dominique was 34 years old, had gotten her start working under her uncle's supervision at his shop as a teenager, and had spent the 11 years since building a reputation on precisely the kind of thoroughness that made her impossible to dismiss once anyone actually gave her the chance to demonstrate it. She'd heard some version of Preston's comment more times than she could count over the years, assumptions made before she'd said a single word. Questions about whether the actual mechanic was available. Customers who addressed every remark to whichever man happened to be standing nearest her, regardless of whether he worked there at all. Before we get any further, if this is your first time here, hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Because the next week wasn't only about one arrogant fleet manager getting a second opinion he didn't need. It was about an entire community deciding that a mechanic who'd earned every bit of her reputation deserved to see exactly how far that reputation actually reached. Now, back 11 years, to the shop where Dominique first learned the trade. Dominique's Uncle Ray had run a small shop on the edge of Bellwood for 30 years, and had taken his niece on as an unofficial apprentice the summer she turned 17, recognizing in her the same patient, methodical curiosity about engines that had defined his own career. She'd gotten her A certifications one at a time over the following decade, working nights and weekends through community college, and had opened Ashford Auto and Cycle 8 years ago, with a loan her uncle co-signed, and a waiting list of customers who'd followed her from his shop the moment she was ready to run her own. She'd built the kind of reputation that mattered most in a trade like hers. Mechanics across the region who called her for a second opinion on problems they couldn't solve themselves. Riders who drove considerable distances past other shops specifically to reach hers. A shop floor kept meticulously organized, because she'd learned early that sloppy habits cost customers money and mechanics credibility in equal measure. None of that reputation had ever fully stopped strangers from making the same assumption Preston made the moment he walked through her door that Tuesday morning. Preston Yates managed the regional fleet for a mid-sized delivery company and had been sent to find a new maintenance contractor after his previous shop's prices climbed past what corporate wanted to keep paying. He'd chosen Ashford Auto from an online listing without doing much further research, and had walked in with the settled confidence of a man who'd never once considered that the shop's owner might not match whatever image he'd built in his head beforehand. "I'd like a second opinion," Preston repeated, "from someone with actual experience." "You're welcome to get one," Dominique said, her voice even, "but you'll be paying twice for a diagnosis I've already given you correctly. Your fuel pressure regulator is failing intermittently, which is exactly why the other two shops you've mentioned couldn't catch it on a single visit. I caught it because I ran your van for 45 minutes under load instead of 5. Preston's composure held, though something in his expression suggested he hadn't expected her to have an answer ready. "I didn't realize this was that kind of shop," he said, glancing again around the garage. The comment landing with a weight neither of them needed spelled out further. Dominique had heard that particular phrase enough times over 11 years to recognize exactly what it meant without him finishing the thought. "It's the kind of shop that's been A's certified longer than some of your current contractors have been driving," she said. "I'll have your paperwork ready whenever you're ready to discuss it professionally." Preston left without signing anything, muttering something about corporate needing to review other options, and it was only after the door closed behind him that Jasper finally spoke. "You've been dealing with that for how long?" Jasper asked. 7 words. "Longer than I want to count," Dominic said, already turning back to the engine bay. "It's fine. I'm used to it." "It shouldn't have to be fine," Jasper said. Jasper didn't confront Preston directly. He'd learned, over 16 years in the Iron Vow, that the most effective response to exactly this kind of moment wasn't outrage in the room where it happened, but making sure the truth of it reached considerably further than Preston expected it to. He mentioned what he'd witnessed to a few other riders who used Dominique's shop, and within days, a clearer picture had assembled itself. Preston had made similar comments at 2 other minority-owned shops in the region over the past year. Each time leaving without signing a contract, each time citing vague concerns about experience that never quite held up to scrutiny once anyone looked closely at the shop's actual certifications and reviews. A rider whose daughter worked in Preston's company's corporate compliance office made a call that mattered more than any confrontation could have, flagging a pattern of vendor rejections that, cross-referenced against ownership demographics, looked considerably less like careful cost management and more like something a compliance department would want to examine directly. Preston's supervisors opened a review within the week, pulling his vendor selection history back 3 years, and found exactly the pattern his own company's data had been quietly recording the whole time. Minority-owned shops rejected at a rate that had nothing to do with pricing or quality, and everything to do with assumptions Preston had never once had to justify out loud until somebody finally asked him to. Meanwhile, word of what had happened at Ashford Auto moved through the wider riding community the way stories like that always did. Not with outrage, but with the quiet, deliberate decision of people who'd already trusted Dominique for years to make sure everyone else knew exactly why. Engines, first, and then chrome filling the street outside Ashford Auto and Cycle as the morning light spread over Bellwood. 130 motorcycles rolling in from every direction. Riders who'd heard one story about a mechanic dismissed in her own shop and needed nothing further explained. Engines dying in sequence until the street held nothing but the tick of 130. Cooling engines and a silence deep enough that Dominique, stepping out to see what had gathered, pressed one hand against the doorframe to steady herself. Not one rider came to cause trouble. They came with their bikes, their trucks, their fleet vehicles, filling her service schedule 3 months out before the morning even ended, a display of confidence in her work that needed no further statement than the sheer number of people willing to make it. Jasper found her on the sidewalk, still processing the scale of what had gathered. "You didn't do anything to earn this today," he said. "You earned it 11 years ago. Today's only everybody finally saying so out loud, all at once." "I don't know what to say," Dominique whispered, both hands pressed to her mouth. "Don't say anything," Jasper said. "Send us a bill for all this work you're about to be doing." Dominique laughed despite herself, the first full laugh anyone had heard from her all week. Preston was quietly reassigned within the month, his company issuing a revised vendor policy that required documented, objective criteria for every rejected contractor going forward. A policy change 3 other minority-owned shops in the region would benefit from over the following year without ever knowing exactly whose oversight had prompted it. He didn't deserve more of this story than that. He didn't get more. Ashford Auto and Cycle's schedule stayed full for months afterward, Dominique hiring 2 additional mechanics for the first time in the shop's history to keep pace with a waiting list that had, almost overnight, become considerably longer than she'd ever imagined it could be. She started a Saturday apprenticeship program that fall, training 3 local teenagers the same way her Uncle Ray had once trained her, making sure the next generation of mechanics who looked like her walked into their first shop already carrying proof that the work spoke louder than anyone's assumptions eventually could. She still keeps her uncle's old toolbox in the corner of her office, unused now, but never moved. A reminder of exactly where 11 years of getting dismissed and proving people wrong had actually started. If this story reached you, if you believe that competence should always be judged by the work itself and nothing else, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs reminding that a reputation built honestly over years has a way of outlasting anyone who ever tried to overlook it. Subscribe to Iron Vow Stories so you never miss the next one. And tell me in the comments, has anyone ever underestimated your skill before they'd even seen you use it?